Hello, hello. At the time of recording this, it's been a little while since I have done any videos because there's been a lot that's been happening. I've been working on a couple of collab products with some other Blender creators. I've been setting up a talent agency system of which we've been inundated with applications. So that's basically an attempt for me to help connect freelancers with clients. And I'm excited to get started with that, like actually actively sharing people. And it's also been my birthday. So I've been quite, busy doing a variety of things. Although in this video, I just want to give a little bit of a update on my post-COVID issue, because this is something that I've kind of been keeping people updated about over the years, because it's like an ongoing investigation and there's no answers for it. So if there's anyone that kind of finds it interesting, because I know that, it's affected so many people, and there are people in my audience, whenever I mention it, they're like, oh, I've got this ongoing thing, or my friend's got this problem ever since COVID. I just want to give a little bit of an update, throw it out into the ether on like the theory around what's causing it and how I'm managing it. So for context, we'll rewind and I'll give the brief explanation for anyone that's unaware. In 2020, obviously we had the COVID pandemic. It is quite likely that it actually started sometime before it was recognized as being a pandemic. So in previous months, then over the course of the year beforehand, when it hit in a kind of more officially recognized period, when the lockdown started, it kind of highlighted a whole bunch of insufficiencies with healthcare systems around the world, because obviously kind of being inundated with the number of cases and the kind of anxiety and the fear of it really put stress on pressure points in the system that may or may not have already been highlighted in previous situations. Like an example here in the UK is, I'm pretty sure the COVID pandemic effectively fast-tracked the development of like an app to access your like NHS healthcare stuff, because it was such like an admin and bureaucratic heavy system in the past, and back then, and is pretty much still the case now, there are a lot of situations where like really obscure symptoms and cases kind of got filtered out just because the flow chart of diagnoses was not established to deal with complex situations. Now that is still true, but I feel like it's something that was highlighted then, in part because COVID seems to produce so many unexpectedly connected side effects lasting a long period of time, potentially for the rest of someone's life, that it may have started to kind of get into people's consciousness that, our diagnostic flowcharts for everything are wrong and need to be updated now. Because it may be the case that this thing happening in this part of the body is actually associated with this thing, whereas we didn't think such a connection could be possible in the past. So an example of something like that would be mast cell disorders. It is becoming increasingly clear that people are coming away from COVID with mast cell activation syndromes / disorders who had otherwise no issues with that in the past, or it may be possible, for example, that there was a genetic predisposition, but it just didn't manifest until something like COVID came along and then hit. And that may actually be something that's kind of happening in my case. Now, I don't know for sure, but I believe that my first exposure to COVID was so mild that I kind of almost didn't know that it happened. The only thing I have recorded down in my notes, because I tend to be a prolific note keeper, but 2020 was still kind of relatively early days for my note keeping. Not exactly, because I had been recording other stuff for a few years before that, but my notes suggested that I had like a runny nose, I think anyway, and like maybe a tickle in the throat that kind of came and went. So very mild, not much else, easier than like a regular cold. After that, I started experiencing breathlessness. Now, the thing about this breathlessness, which has made it extremely difficult, actually impossible, to get any appropriate advice or help about it, is that the global healthcare system and healthcare knowledge is completely insufficient and inadequate for dealing with subjective breathlessness. So basically sensory breathlessness, meaning the lungs are fine. There's nothing wrong with the lungs. Every diagnostic flowchart is, I would say, overconfident with the fact that, patient has X breathing sensation, therefore Y pulmonary issue. It is not equipped to deal with neurological or complex immune signaling issues. For lack of a better term, it is extraordinarily primitive. So when going to a doctor and discussing, after COVID, I have breathless issue, naturally their mind goes to, 90% of the people I treat are old people with pulmonary issues, therefore you must be a patient with pulmonary issues. Over the course of about 6 months after it appeared, I made a definitive and very confusing discovery. It didn't really matter at the time that I didn't understand it, because after making the discovery, I could adjust my lifestyle / diet and move around it. What I discovered was that out of nowhere, so basically like just one random random day, again, as I believe after COVID, a mild case, I started reacting to milk. And what I mean reacting is I would have milk and then maybe like a day or a couple of days later, this breathless sensation would spike up. So it's not an immediate reaction. When you looked at it on a chart of severity, you'd be able to see the milk, delay, rise in the sensation. It took a long time to figure that out, and a lot of kind of analyzing ingredients and kind of, making comparisons between diets, and then what comes afterwards is a predictable pattern. And it turns out the predictable pattern was surrounding the milk protein. It occurred more with products that had stuff like butter in it, for example. And I was always wondering about protein. I didn't really understand proteins at the time. I was like, does something change with the proteins if they're like cooked or prepared in a different way? Now I would understand like the denaturing of proteins, and would now have a better understanding of the different types of milk protein, like A1 and A2 casein. We'll get onto that. I discovered that just having milk alone wasn't enough to cause the dyspnea. Dyspnea is a weird word to use, but it's basically the word for breathlessness. If I had milk and then followed a day or so later by something irritating like vinegar, alcohol, something acidic, then the breathlessness would spike. So it had to have these two things. Irritation alone was fine. Low levels of milk were fine unless it passed a threshold. So if it was a lot of milk, then the breathlessness would happen anyway, but a low level would only kind of manifest as breathlessness if then accompanied afterwards by irritation of some kind of the esophagus. Now I had all sorts of tests done, every kind of blood test. We were checking for all different kinds of like anemia. I had an endoscopy done. I had biopsies done of the intestinal tract, and everything was perfect. The doctor I had was really good and a really impressive gastroenterologist. He was really thorough, but he had not encountered anything like this before. What I did over time was I avoided milk protein, I avoided irritants, and I was put on omeprazole, later changed to lansoprazole as a PPI because I had a theory about like gastric acid irritation. But I'd always had acid issues before that. But eventually, over time, over months, the dyspnea went away. The breathlessness went away. And actually what happened was over time, I could reintroduce milk protein. And it was largely okay. It was manageable. I would only notice slight days where I would get that breathlessness. If I had something like butter, I would be able to look back and go, oh, I had a sandwich a couple of days ago and it had butter in it, but I didn't realize. And then I would go off it again and things would be fine. So I sort of learned at that point that I had a tolerance, that this would be an ever-present thing, but I just needed to stay within a certain tolerance. And again, I did not understand why milk all of a sudden did this, but I was very comfortable living within that tolerance because I could have chocolate and cheese and all sorts, and I'd be perfectly fine. I just had to avoid the major triggers, which were things like, well, butter being one of the worst things. So some years went by and I was happy with my, success in conquering the issue until we get to the end of 2025. Now, I will say I did have multiple COVID vaccinations in between this time, but I don't know exactly what they were. They weren't all mRNA. I don't actually know if any of them were mRNA until this one at the end of 2025, when I had a definitely mRNA Moderna vaccination in the arm. Between 1 and 2 weeks later, which is actually the same kind of time scale that the breathing issue originally appeared back in 2020 after that record of the, running nose and such. 1 to 2 weeks later, the breathlessness reappeared, but to an extreme level, far worse than anything that happened in 2020. It was truly terrifying and awful. And I did the best I could to stay calm because I knew that things would be worse if I let panic set in. Because even if I panicked and went to the hospital, they would not be able to help. And don't worry, I did contact my doctor and, try and go through another discovery phase of giving them an opportunity to figure it out, but they still could not in the end. But, I was calm because I was like, if you end up in an ambulance, if you end up in hospital and they're not going to be able to do anything, then you're going to get yourself more and more worked up and they'll get discharged, they'll call it an anxiety disorder, and you're just going to be struggling. So I stayed calm and I thought, you know what, I've gone through this once and I'll get through it again. However, it has now been well over a year since that episode started, and realistically, I am no closer to getting it solved. This has been the worst episode so far. But throughout this year plus since that vaccine, I have learned a lot of things. And there have been moments where I've managed to get the breathing to go away, if only for about 2 days or so. I reported in previous videos that one thing I noticed relatively quickly was that instead of me reacting to just specifically milk protein, I was now reacting to many different types of food. That's something that didn't happen before. I noticed of the foods that spiked out the most in my data gathering, because I started doing a lot of data crunching in spreadsheets this time. I've been recording so much more data, tens of thousands of data points even. I noticed that the foods that seemed to have the largest impact were high histamine containing foods, and or foods which were generally labeled as histamine liberators online. And this got me investigating mast cell disorders, where mast cells, which are like important immune cells, are kind of littering your tissues and looking out for invaders. They can get sensitized, they're kind of hyperreactive, and they will release inflammatory signals when triggered. And they can be triggered by a range of things, but there are certain types of components in your diet which can be regarded as histamine liberators, which means that they're more likely to trigger histamine to release. And the release of histamine from mast cells can also contribute to a cascade where neighboring mast cells also release their inflammatory mediators, and this can go on and on and on. This can have a range of other effects where, like, a lot of people, when they have like more systemic release, they end up with things like hives around their skin, but I don't get any of that, which is interesting. So I noticed I was reacting to high histamine foods and histamine liberating foods, but the only thing that would manifest is the breathlessness. However, it seems that when mast cells release, they do affect nearby nerves. They make the nerves more excitable, more likely to fire. It kind of changes the tone or the profile of the signal. And after the kind of discovery from the first episode where I noticed esophageal irritation contributed to the dyspnea after ingesting certain types of compound, I thought, well, my mind is more focused on this area, esophagus and stomach, and I started trying to piece two and two together, and I thought, what if it's mast cells in this area that are releasing so that the vagal nerve branches are sensitized? So when something irritates there now, they're more likely to fire, and when they fire, they kind of change the profile of the breathing sensations, because the vagus nerve meets at the nucleus of the solitary tract in the brainstem with other information that composes your sense of full breath. Other sources include things like the carotid bodies in the neck, which report information on the blood O2 level and acidity. Now, this is important because this kind of comes into contact with COVID in other ways, but I suppose we'll get onto that. I had phases of success and phases of failures, but it seems that no matter what successes I have, it always returns to failure. I noticed that if I had a period of days where things were getting better, the longer the amount of time things were getting better, the more likely it would be on any particular day that things would spike up again. And when they would spike up, there'd be a predictable pattern where it would spike up, maintain a high level for a few days, like a curve. Curve was quite predictable. It'd go down, bounce up, and then go back down again. So there was always like this little fake out moment. And it's a repeatable pattern that was visible everywhere. And I was thinking, so why is there this repeatable pattern? We have a moment of calm, then we have a huge spike that sustains for several days, and then it starts relaxing and then spikes again. When looking at mast cells, it is possible they kind of build up granules of chemicals, these inflammatory signals. They can release in one go, or they can do a partial release, but they can also release a lot in one go, and that's where I feel like a cascade happens in the data. There's a sudden jump. Then it takes a while as the system is reacting and histamine needs to clear out the body. It does that through the liver in some way. Also, I've got Gilbert syndrome, which means I've got high kind of blood bilirubin level. So when it comes to things filtering out the liver, there's always in my mind this kind of idea of competing clearance in some way, slower clearance. And then maybe that curve we're seeing is this returning to a more stabilized level after the cascade and after things have been a bit more cleared, and then we get a chance to return to stability again before it happens again. Then maybe in that interim time, things are building up, granules are like refilling the cells, etc. I wasn't sure if there was much truth to this. However, while doing dietary testing for all this time, I did notice something interesting. Sometimes substances like milk protein would have such an unbelievably strong impact and potentially cause one of these huge, like multi-day, week-long trigger moments, one of these cascades. But weirdly, at other times, I would have milk protein and nothing would happen. I was like, what? And then I'd get lulled into a false sense of security. I'd have milk protein again, and then all of a sudden, poof, like a week of terrible sensations again. So it always kind of struck me like I didn't really want to overthink it too much, but I was like, why is it so unpredictable? Even at other moments, for example, I'd be able to have like sweet barbecue sauce with my food. And then I realized that, a few months later, sweet barbecue sauce was causing like a large chunk of the breathing issue to spike within my current diet at the time. And then when I removed it, it got better again. Not gone, but stabilized. But that didn't happen before. So it seems like at various points in the process, the things which are the most active triggers in the data phase out, and then other things become the active trigger. And I know that may sound like unreliable data, but in those periods of time, these things were repeatably testable. I could have the substance and it would happen again and again and again. And then when that kind of time period shifted, it wouldn't do it anymore. But then something else would. So it kind of became this impossible issue to track. I went through many theories. I was even looking at, when you get injected with an mRNA vaccine, the ribosomes in your body, they read the mRNA code, they make spike protein. I got to thinking maybe some of the spike protein leaves the tissues, diffuses into the blood. The spike protein then binds to things, ACE2 receptors, on the carotid bodies that sense blood oxygen levels and such. Then there's an overactive immune response to that. Then some of the carotid body cells get destroyed, and that affects the signaling to the nucleus tractus solitarius in the brainstem, and then that affects like the kind of sense of breathlessness, the processing. And maybe that would be why whenever I'm encountering COVID, the issue spikes up again and again, because maybe the same thing happens. However, spike protein being generated by the body, diffusing into the blood and then causing issues is quite a contentious thing as to whether or not it actually happens. I mean, I've kind of decided now, again, I'm not going to recommend to people not to get mRNA vaccines, but I will never get one ever again in my life for COVID. Knowing that when proteins bind to receptors on cells, it can activate functions. And I don't want anything in my body activating or modulating or sensitizing if I can avoid it. I don't want anything binding anywhere that shouldn't be. So the idea of having my body generate spike protein where it could possibly move somewhere, where it could possibly interact with something else, I'm not going to do that. Before learning more about the milk protein connection, I was investigating molecular mimicry, because I was like, what if, when I got antibodies for COVID, maybe the antibodies are mistaking part of the milk protein for COVID and then kind of overreacting to it. And then where it's encountering those kind of peptide components of the milk protein, then there's an overreacting immune response. Then the inflammation kind of sensitizes the nerves, sends weird signals, causes breathlessness. And I thought maybe, there are examples of molecular mimicry for antibodies like elsewhere, but there's no way of proving that, at least not easily. But then I moved away from that idea because I learned that there is actually something special about milk. Specifically a certain type of milk protein called A1 casein. It turns out that A1 casein, when digested, can break down into various components, just little kind of chunks of the original protein structure. One of them is something called beta-casomorphin 7, which has been studied quite a lot. Studies into it have sometimes been a bit controversial when trying to associate it with things like autism. But something important to note is that beta-casomorphin 7, specifically in regards to when looking at immortal cell lines for mast cells, has been recorded as liberating inflammatory mediators from mast cells. I'm looking at an abstract of a post, Stimulation of Luva Mast Cells by Beta-casomorphin 7 and Gliadorphin. I might have pronounced that wrong. February 2019, from the Journal of Allergy and Clinical Immunology. So thinking about the idea of mast cells, it may be that when I first got in contact with COVID, we ended up with this situation where my mast cells, particularly along the gastric tract, were all of a sudden primed and ready to release, whereas they had never been before. And that it just so happened that in this prime state, when I digest milk protein, because again, remember I said that it was never an immediate response. It looked nothing like a traditional allergy. It may be that during/after digestion, this beta-casomorphin 7 may be a strong implicator in the release of these inflammatory signals. And this is affecting the nerve signaling to the brain for the breathing. It's one of the most likely and most promising kind of threads of thought for why all of a sudden a non-IgE responds to milk, producing a sensory issue. But it doesn't explain everything because, like I said, during this 2025 onwards episode, lasting over a year now. Well, technically it was all of 2025, but it was the end of 2024. I might have missaid that earlier. It was December 2024. Then I started recording at the end of that. It was January, all of 2025. Now we're 2026. Sorry, the years get a bit confusing in the head. 2024, all of 2025. February 2026. But when thinking about all these other foods, another strong one is yeast extract. Yeast extract in a food has been one of the strongest triggers for me in this last episode, to the point where it's kind of insane how much of an effect it has. It seems to have a stronger effect than milk protein in my testing, across the different phases of time in this episode. There's also honey and molasses. Molasses was weird because it was fine for a while. Then all of a sudden, if I started having anything with molasses in it, then it would get worse. Like I said, the target keeps shifting. But then I tried to think kind of more mechanistically. I was like, maybe I'm just looking at this the wrong way. If the dietary focus keeps shifting, then there is something else mechanistically that's shifting that. We have this idea about the mast cells, which seems pretty suitable, but there's no easy way for me to prove that to someone like a doctor, because I'm not having any of the traditional symptoms that are associated with mast cell diseases. Because again, this is more like a local thing rather than a systemic thing. So I've been thinking recently, I don't know how I came to this conclusion, but it seems pretty important. How would beta-casomorphin 7 from milk actually get to the mast cells? How does it interact with it? Well, let's think about how milk protein would travel through the digestive tract. When it gets into the stomach, it would start breaking down because you've got enzymes there, and the breakdown would continue through the small intestine and carry on throughout. So it's contained in the lumen. But where are mast cells? Well, they are in the lining, but they're more so concentrated just beyond like the lining, even though I think they're technically like everywhere, but they're more so kind of just beyond the lining. So useful components from food are absorbed through, you got like the villi and microvilli in the gut wall. So to encounter the mast cells, the compound has to be able to touch it, and it may do that along the surface, but it would have to get kind of more permeably beyond the epithelial wall where the mast cells are more concentrated. And then if it does that, then maybe, my theory would be, it is more likely to trigger a cascade because there would be a higher density of mast cell interaction there. And this would start making sense to me because it would start to explain why, for example, like I said, one day I would be able to have milk and then have no reaction at all. Then a week later, maybe I could have milk and then have a huge reaction. And it would start to explain this disparity a bit because in a way it almost boils down to slightly random chance, because as it's traveling through the intestine, it may encounter a mast cell or multiple mast cells enough to trigger a cascade of some kind, or it may not. Maybe the rest of the contents keeps it more contained for a certain period of the intestine, or maybe there's a variable of permeability, which makes it more likely to interact with cells just beyond the epithelial layer there. Now, again, I'm not an expert in that, but it does make sense to me about why there's such like a shifting variable response to different types of foods, most of which are largely considered to be histamine liberators, like yeast extract. So it got me thinking about, well, what makes the gut permeable? Because, there's something called leaky gut. Now, the term leaky gut is not maybe an ideal one to use because leaky gut is a controversial thing. I think it's mostly because of the name. Your gut doesn't really leak as such. But I think when thinking about the idea of a gut being more permeable to toxins, for example, or certain types of peptides, it may be more appropriate to say, well, maybe there's a breakdown of the tight junctions of the cells lining the epithelium, or maybe there's a lack of mucus. So when we say leaky gut, maybe these are variables that are trying to describe that. So I was trying to look at things in my diet that would affect those things. And one of the strongest, it seems, that is associated with like a permeable gut barrier is alcohol, which seems like a pretty obvious one. The thing is, I have been having alcohol throughout this episode, this long, over year-long episode. But in my data, it never flagged up as a trigger, not very obviously. In recent times, it sort of has, but it's not obvious. The data is not so concise that you can have a lot of alcohol one day and then see a big spike on the other. But it seems to be the case that if there are periods of time where I have been having alcohol, then the average severity rises. So rather than sudden spikes, or rather than it causing sudden spikes, it causes the severity to start increasing again slowly. Now, there may be like a whole range of reasons. You might think about inflammation, fine, whatever. But I actually think maybe, and this is something I'm testing now, occasional alcohol has actually been more like a gateway that's affecting the gut lining and therefore making it more likely for other things to then trigger an immune response on or within the cell lining of the gut, therefore more likely to trigger any kind of cascade. So I've started doing a test where I'm going completely off of alcohol entirely, but that's not even the whole picture, because I also noticed within this very short period of time of coming off alcohol, there's also something else. Like I drink a lot of Pepsi Max, a carbonated drink, and I've noticed repeatedly, time and time again, on the day-to-day basis, the day-to-day level, the breathing is always worse when I drink Pepsi than when I don't. And I think it's an irritant. What I said before about the first time I had an episode in 2020, I noticed if I had milk protein and then later in time had something irritating, that it would cause the breathing. I think this may be constantly happening for me now. And I'm having Pepsi every day, therefore I'm constantly re-triggering the sensation. However, I think part of the problem may be that because I'm constantly stimulating and irritating, and this is causing like a signal, I think my brain can't down-regulate. It can't readapt to a baseline because I'm constantly triggering. And so the sensitivity of that signal has gone way down low, or way high, I should be say, if it's sensitivity. So maybe part of the reason why I'm having such a hard time kind of getting out of this episode is because I'm constantly stimulating the nerve as all the carbonation, the acidity of it is going down, that I'm not giving my brain an opportunity to adapt. And then that time goes by and I'm not giving it the opportunity. Then maybe it's been a bit of time since I had any alcohol. Then suddenly I'll have alcohol again. It opens the gateway. The diet triggers things again. It goes back up. And maybe I'm just in this cyclic phase where we're constantly re-triggering this like immune effect and we're not giving any space for readaptation. So that's where I'm at the moment. That's what I'm testing. I've also done continuous testing with dozens of types of supplements, including those that are supposed to be mast cell stabilizers and those that are supposed to help with like the gut wall, encouraging tight junctions to reform, etc. Nothing seems to do anything. If anything, the only thing that feels like it makes some kind of difference is palmitoylethanolamide, otherwise known as P or PEA. The only thing I think this might do for me is it may reduce, you would get like this kind of cold anxiety feeling, which is when I think I can feel the degranulation happening of the cells. It's not anxiety mediated. It really was a case that if I had a trigger 2 days later, or maybe even 1 day later, I would literally just be sitting here and I'd get this weird ooh, like that kind of cold body anxiety feeling. I could be doing something really fun. I could be super calm, enjoying my time, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, it just goes ooh, and you're like, that doesn't feel right. And I think, again, anecdotally, palmitoylethanolamide might be the only thing that actually reduces that. Nothing else I've tried seems to have any impact on any part of it at all. One of my doctors recommended antihistamine tests, but that wouldn't stop the mast cells from degranulating anyway. So if I had to guess, if it is a mast cell disorder, people like me should probably be offered mast cell stabilizing drugs. However, I don't think that's a proper solution. So right now, like I said, I'm entering this phase where I've got this new adaptation model. We've got gut permeability, we've got mast cell cascades, we've got the brain stem learning sensory pattern through the vagus nerve, possible interaction with the carotid bodies. And now we're going to try and stabilize both of these things at once. Repair the lining if there's any problem with that, reduce irritation, and some retraining, some breathing retraining, and see if any of that helps to tilt the severity on a lower trend again. Now, obviously, I should say that none of this stuff is, like medically fact or proven, but I'm just putting some anecdotal explorations out there just for historical context and for provenance. So if there's any like researchers that are interested in the individual experiences people are having post-COVID or post-COVID vaccine, then this will be one of those logs. And again, this isn't intending to guide people in any way that are having their own issues, because I'm still struggling, right? So don't take it from me. I'm not great at finding the solution for this particular issue. Sadly, I haven't been as successful as I have been with my other medical issues. I've had far more success in solving those, but maybe it gives you some things to research and think about. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great day.